Welcome everyone to another episode of Living Life with James. Today is going to be the day to get into a hot topic. I cannot wait to talk about sexual health as a part of our mental health and how they affect one another. And today I am super excited to bring on Reba Thomas, as many people call her, Reba the Diva. Reba is a sex educator or sex expert. And she has so many great, she has so much great knowledge, so many great tools and tips to kind of help us navigate this topic. So it's important for us to really kind of get her insights into things and just help us talk about how to create a safe space to have these discussions and how to be able to really navigate this whole world. So anyway, please help me welcome Miss Reba Thomas to this podcast.
Hey. Thank you so much for having me, Dr. James. I'm so happy to be here.
Reba, I love that you're here. You know, the first thing that I feel like I need to put out there before we even get into this topic is how we met and why you're here. You know, I feel like the universe puts people in our lives for a reason. And I have been blessed, lucky, fortunate to be able to be a part of 90 Day Fiancé, The Last Resort. And that's where Reba and I connected instantly. I felt her energy. I am honored that I had the opportunity to sit, connect. Now we're good friends, and here's Reba. So we met on the set of 90 Day Fiancé, The Last Resort.
Yeah, we did.
And Reba, that's what leads us to today, to be able to have these conversations. And I'm really so thankful. I have so much gratitude for you coming into my world or me coming into your world and us being able to continue to grow, have a connection, friendship, personally, professionally. It's definitely been a gift for me.
Oh, same here, James.
So I'm excited to get into this topic.
Yes.
I wanted to talk about mental health. You know, I was saying mental health and sexual health, really, they're two in the same. And
absolutely.
I want to break down, you know, actually, we should probably start with the concept of sexual health. And as I'm thinking about it, sexual health is really the state of our physical health, our emotional health, our mental and social well-being. And I always really want to talk about how it's all related to sexuality, but this goes beyond kind of the idea of, you know, the absence of disease or dysfunction. It's really about navigating kind of navigating our sexuality and sexual health in a positive and a respectful manner as it relates to ourselves and other relationships.
Absolutely. James, I think a lot of times, especially like in clinical settings, folks use the deficit model. And, you know, that's like, oh, is there an absence of STI, ST? Like, you know, is there something wrong with the functioning here? And I like to think of myself as like a pleasure positive sex educator because in the land of like negatives and like, you know, how to prevent pregnancy or how to get pregnant or, you know, how to prevent STIs or how, you know, making sure that like, you know, our actual health is in order. But I think we often kind of overlook the mental health aspect of sexual health, right? Like a lot of things can impact the way that we feel about ourselves, our bodies, our sexualities, right?
Right.
The 3 M's for me are like the 3 biggest influencers for folks. And that's the media, medicine, and morality, right? So the media, right, says, you know, how big we should be, how small we should be, how tall we should be, how much sex we should be having, how little sex we should be having, who should be having sex, when you should be having it, where you should be having it, how you should be having it, right? So the media greatly influences the way we look at our sexual health, but so does medicine, right? When we are experiencing dysfunction or discomfort, or if we've experienced trauma or pain, it can be really hard to talk about. Also, as we get older, you know, medicine isn't so sweet to people. Like I think about how when you've had a baby over 35, they call it a geriatric pregnancy. I don't think anyone under 90 or 80 should be called geriatric anything, right? But this is the state of how we live. And then, you know, the big piece is morality, religion, the messages that we get from our family and friends and, you know, good girls, good guys, boys, girls should do or shouldn't do. And so there's a lot, that comes from the mental health aspect, right? That you would unpack with a therapist that impacts how you feel about yourself and your sexuality and the pleasure that you experience when you're intimate.
You just said, as you unpack this, with a therapist, life coach, so important, because as you just mentioned, those 3 big M's, my hands started feeling a little clammy. I started feeling a little tense. And there's so many, at least for me, I think, feelings of being overwhelmed, feelings of what to say, what not to say, this concept of things being taboo, right? It's like we are controlled by these 3 M's in so many ways that it makes it difficult to talk about it in our relationships, which can be unhealthy.
And when we don't talk about it, it's not normalized, right? Yeah. And the biggest thing that I see in my work is like people kind of trying to figure out what's normal, right? Wanting to be normal, chastising people who aren't normal, right? But I think normal is relative. And I think the more that we normalize each other's experiences, the more we normalize talking about sex and talking about sexual health, I think the easier and the less stigma there will be around this conversation. And I see it happening already now, right? Like,
yes, let's just say that is why we are here, right? Because this is a topic, we'll just put it under the umbrella of sexual health. This is a topic that we shy away from. And so it's critical to be able to at least have these conversations and put them out there and discuss, what this means and how to really navigate through this world for yourself and for your relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I see that same shift happening with mental health, right? Like 20 years ago, mental health was like not a thing that people were talking about, right? Like it was not, we weren't talking about therapy. We weren't talking about, what impacts your mental health, taking mental health days off. What is that? Right. But 20 years later, and here we are, like, there's therapy on television and, you can throw a rock and find a therapist. And so I think that
we're getting there.
Seeing that shift, right, makes us a little bit more receptive and open to the shift in talking about sexual health and pleasure.
That's a great point. And I was just going to say, the idea that we are trying our best to destigmatize mental health, and we still have a long way to go with our sexual health, but I can see it starting to make some shifts, as you said, maybe in the media with topics around topics surrounding, body imaging, consent. These are some hot topics we're hearing. So I'm hopeful that if we continue these conversations, we'll take some of the stigma away from sexual health as well.
Yeah. And I think we'll also start to make the connections too, right? Between, violations of consent and agency and, the way that we show up sexually or, the messages that we're sending. Like, I think about how we look at some Disney movies now and we're like, ooh, cringe, right? And so that shows a shift, growth, right? Towards, understanding how agency and bodily autonomy and consent are important and how they should be, held going forward in the future. And so I just, I see those as little glimmers of hope, if you will.
I agree. And I'm right there with you. Let's get really into it. I'm wondering, Reba, in your experiences, what makes this so difficult? Why is it challenging to really be able to talk about this topic, to be able to talk about sexual health?
It's all the taboos, right? It's all the things that we aren't sure if we should or shouldn't say. How are people going to feel? Is there judgment around it? There's also just a lot of vulnerability in like really opening up about yourself in that way, right? I think sex is a really vulnerable act, especially, you're naked or partially naked. And so that's a really vulnerable act, but it's even more vulnerable to talk about. Right. And I think because we don't talk about it, a lot of people aren't really connected to their desires, to their bodies, to what they want, to how they want it. And so what is there to talk about? Right. Like,
thank you for saying that. I'm thinking about the clients that I work with, and you just hit the nail on the head. Vulnerability. And it is so important to discuss the concept of vulnerability for ourselves with our clients, the people that we're working with. When you're able to be vulnerable and have communication, I know that affects trust. It affects the intimacy, and it really makes a positive impact for yourself and the relationship. So vulnerability is key, and I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there was one of my colleagues said to me one day that, the difference between embarrassment and intimacy is acceptance. Because embarrassment is vulnerability and rejection, right?
That makes sense.
And intimacy is vulnerability and acceptance. And
Isn't
so
that
at the heart of both of those things is vulnerability, right?
at the heart
So
of it?
so out of fear of being embarrassed, I think a lot of people don't talk about sex.
We're starting to work our way into this, because my next question, I would love to know, the connection. What do you see, or how would you see the connection between mental health and sexual health?
Ooh, it's inextricably linked. The brain is the biggest sexual organ in the body. And so when our mental health is suffering, oftentimes our sexual health will suffer as well, or be impacted, right?
Yes.
Because there are some folks who, when their mental health is suffering, they like to get it in like jackrabbits, because that's the way that they receive dopamine, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And
In the
serotonin,
brain.
right?
Yeah.
Like it's a chemical thing, right? They need this for themselves. This is why you see a lot of ADHDers can be hypersexual, because that dopamine, especially when their ADHD isn't managed, that dopamine makes them just jackrabbits, right? And so, so I think it's inextricably linked, right? And so when we understand that the brain is the biggest sexual organ in the body, if the brain is struggling in some way, it's going to be a little harder to reach pleasure or satisfaction in that way. It's going to be a little harder for your brain and your body to be on the same page, right? I like to think of this analogy. Our bodies are an elephant, and our brains are the man on top, right? You've got an elephant rider on top of the elephant. And look, if the elephant is like tired, there is nothing that little man on top can do to get into that elephant, to get that elephant to move. There's nothing that little man can do, right? But if we start to, like, he can jump on him, he can do all the things. But if we start to really pay attention to the elephant and not the man on top, right? If we say, okay, the elephant really likes, roses. So let's get the elephant some roses. Or the elephant really likes classical music. So let's put on some classical music. Then we'll be more likely to get that elephant to move. Right. And so I think we don't, when we become disconnected in that way, our elephant just sits down. It's like, nope, I'm not doing anything. We're not going anywhere. We're not getting it up. We're not getting it down. We're not getting it hard. We're not getting it soft. We're not getting it wet. We're not getting anything because we're not really paying attention. We're not connected. We're not connected. The man and the elephant are not connected. So let's connect.
That's something I talk about in therapy all the time, right? It's our mindset and kind of getting out of our brain that can affect us, whether it's sex or intimacy, ourselves, our body, our self-esteem, the thoughts about ourselves. So going back, yes, there is I love this idea of the man on the elephant, but we're talking about our mindsets and mental health as it relates to sexual health.
Yeah. And you can't think your way into mental health, right? Like into sexual health. You just can't think your way into it, right? Like, yes, you need to be unpacking the things that are barriers to you mentally, but also there's the body that also has to remember like that connection. It has to remember that joy and that pleasure. And if it doesn't, because it doesn't trust you or the man up there, right? You're going to have a hard time.
And so going back to sexual health is really not, it's physical, but it's mental. And as I'm thinking, as you're talking, emotional as well, right? Because at the end of the day, we have to feel comfortable. We have to feel confident. We have to feel free of shame and anxiety. And when we do, there's this level of self-acceptance that I think affects us.
Oh, there is a level of empowerment and transformation that happens too, right? I see in my work so many times people coming into this space thinking they're going to learn about just sex ed, right? Know how to please their partner or how to, be sexy for themselves.
Yeah.
And their lives change, right? Because they feel more empowered in their bodies, not just in the bedroom, but outside of it as well. So,
you are doing a great deal. The work that you do really is powerful, right? Not just empowering them, but just it's powerful work. And I'm sure people see how it affects themselves and their relationships. So Reba, I'm going to channel my Bethany Frankel right now. You're doing the Lord's work.
Oh, well, thank you. I like to say
You're
that.
helping people.
People joke about that all the time, but I do think that's what it is, right? I think it's about finding your personal power, right?
Yeah.
And to be fair, I call it the erotic, right? And I'm not the first person to call it that. Audre Lorde is an amazing woman, was an amazing woman who wrote an essay about the uses of the erotic. And the erotic is like the seat of our personal power. It's what drives us. It's where we find the things that we could do that would never make us tired. You know what I mean? That's limitless energy. That's erotic. That's the erotic. That's what I call erotic liberation, right? But I don't want to get too deep on you today, James.
Well, there's more topics to come. As you're saying these things, I'm listening to you, and it really comes down to some of the language, the words that we're using, right? And I can see how certain things, even just saying we're talking about sex, right? The taboo nature behind it, how that really ruffles people's feathers and makes people uncomfortable. Then I hear you saying empowerment and what this means for yourself and, how this can affect our mental and emotional. That feels more safe.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Well, yes, right. Yes, it feels more safe because it's not necessarily sex. I think when we start to talk about sex, people get caught up in the pornographic, right? And what I'm talking about is the erotic, right? That's the difference, right? I think we kind of bastardize the erotic into the pornographic, and that's all it is, right? It's only sex, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, that's it, right? Or thank you, sir, in some people's cases, right? And so it's just it's a lot more than that. It's so much more than that, and the way that we connect as humans, it's so much more than that, and so. Yeah, I think that it is it's deeply rooted.
It's
Our
deeply
sexuality,
rooted.
our sexuality, our body image, the way that we think of ourselves, the way that we project ourselves into the world, how free we feel to be in that sexuality that we feel and the desires that we feel, like so
and
much.
saying that, Reba, all of this is really there's a level of self-care. And here's the reality. We can talk about self-care, we can talk about well-being, but to talk about sexual health is still taboo or even off limits.
Yeah. And, that's part of the reason why the work that I do, especially with women and femmes around sexuality and sexual empowerment, I call it sensual self-care.
I like
right? Because that feels safe, right? Not how to be sexy.
We're still addressing the topic.
Yeah, exactly. And also, look, if we think about, it's easy to talk about self-care, like you said. It's easy to talk about doing yoga and eating right and moving in our bodies, but it's not easy to talk about and also the sensuality of those things, right? And it's, for me, it's bigger than just okay, yes, and also we want to have great sex, but sensuality, the act of activating joy and pleasure in the senses, that is a thing that can also incentivize any self-care routine, right? And this is the thing, that's my little magic secret, right? You can throw sensuality onto things that you're resistant about, and then they become oh, I want to do this, incentivized, right? So I
even
think
how you're describing it, I'm interested. Even how you're describing it, it makes me feel comfortable and curious, opposed to what, going back to media or the morality piece, fears, concerns related to this. The way you're discussing it just makes it feel safe and open to discuss.
And that's how it should feel.
That's how it should feel.
That's how it should feel. Just like we can talk about our nose and our ears and our elbows and our arms, we should be able to talk about our vulvas and vaginuses and vaginas and penises and pleasure. And
the story that we're creating for ourselves, for friends, for children, to be able to discuss this in a safe and healthy way.
Yeah. I think about kids a lot when, children are oh, such and such touched my cookie. And it's oh, well, he should, you shouldn't have food anyway. But because we're not, we use words that are safe, right? Cookie, vajayjay, when someone else who's not in the family, who doesn't know these words that we use, right? When it's reported to someone else, then they don't know what's going on, so they can't. It's really hard for us to even do anything about things, right?
You
And
are
so,
bringing up such a great topic, Reba.
language
Again,
matters.
this is going to be a to be continued because there's so many directions we can go into.
Yeah.
Bringing it back and thinking about mental health as it affects us. I'm curious as to what is your take with sexual health as it relates to mental health, specifically with anxiety, how it can affect us in terms of anxiety. I guess let me rephrase all this. I'm getting ahead of myself. Thinking about anxiety, stress, mental health, right? Emotional health. How does that have an impact on our sexual health?
Ooh, it has a huge impact, I think, on our sexual health. I think that our mental health, anxiety, depression, overwhelm, they act in two ways in people, right? They can be a barrier, right? It can be really hard to access pleasure if you're feeling an overwhelm of emotion or anxiety mentally. But I
Yes.
think also, on the flip side of that, we can turn to like having sex or having sexual pleasure very
As a way of
often,
coping.
right? To cope with those things, right?
Good
And
point.
so as like a way of release, if you
Yeah.
will. And
Yeah.
so I think very, very much anxiety and mental health and overwhelm can not just impact our performance, but the context in which we see sex, right? And for a majority of women that we know from research, for a majority of women, that is how they experience their desire. It's
Mm,
contextually, right? So like if they're experiencing overwhelm or stress or whatever, it's really hard to get into those sexy contexts, right? It's
mhm.
hard to step into what makes you feel good because your brain is so focused on all the things outside of what's happening in your body.
I've seen, again, you're making another great point. In my practice, I can relate to this because I've seen clients that completely, when they're experiencing stress, anxiety, shifts in mood, completely just disconnect from intimacy. And it's almost like, because of anxiety and stress, it's almost like there's two different parts. It's like their mind and their body become strangers in some way.
Yes.
And
Yes.
right, that disconnect. And then the other point that you made is how we cope. So if I'm not disconnected, I'm so anxious and stressed, my brain will then cope by, dot, dot, dot. And the dot, dot, dot is because the chemicals in the brain. And I've learned to release these chemicals by engaging in some type of sexual activity. So
But that
there's
doesn't
really
necessarily mean that like that's the thing that you want, right? And then
right.
that can cause problems too with your mental health because now you've done this thing impulsively and it's not the thing that you wanted to do. And perhaps you maybe didn't have great judgment and
Yes.
maybe weren't using protection. And so there's a lot that happens when we're using sex in a reactive way, right? When we're using it as a coping mechanism.
And we learn this. I'm glad we're talking about this now because we learn this from an early age. We learn to cope with stress and anxiety in ways that may be unhealthy, and insert therapy or life coaching to be able to recondition the brain of how to be in a healthy place with these things.
Yeah, but I think we also need to recondition the body too, right? Like I think
Mhm.
the body also has its own responses. And so when once we've worked out the brain stuff, we also have to
Yeah.
get back into the body, right? Reconnect reestablish that connection.
Help me and listeners with that, Reba. So I'm thinking, what are some tools? What are some strategies to either reconnect, but also to cope with, I guess, just anxiety and stress so we
Yeah.
don't completely disconnect from ourselves or
Yeah.
intimacy?
Yeah. So a few things, right? I think exercises that help to complete the stress cycle are going
Mm.
to be your best bet, right? There's a great book by Emily Nagoski. Dr.
Okay.
Emily Nagoski, called Burnout. She also wrote Come As You Are, but that's a whole nother conversation. The burnout is about how stress impacts everything in our life, right? From not just our sexuality, but like our mental health, right? Our physical health, our all the things. And so one of the things that activates stress is the stress cycle, right? Once we are feeling stress, we are in the middle of this stress cycle. You know this. And so our bodies have this fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response.
That's right.
And when we find ourselves in the middle of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, it's important that we do something to complete the stress cycle, right? Laugh, primal screaming, crying in your car, or, in a closet somewhere, right?
Yes.
I like to do it in the shower.
These are important things, because as you're saying that, my brain's thinking about what I share with clients and the concept of grounding techniques, right?
Yes.
And grounding techniques could be, mindfulness with body scans and breathing and relaxation. As you said, getting out, movement, right?
Yes.
Whether it's getting outside. I always talk about, in terms of mind-body connection, relaxation. There's this thing called progressive muscle relaxation, or even, right, where you're breathing and tensing the muscles, or even just being silly and shaking it off, right? That's what
animals do, right? That's what animals do. If you've ever noticed, like a dog, like if he's scared, he goes outside, he's barking, woo, 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 he comes back inside and he's like shaking. He's like, he shakes a few times, right? He's completing his stress cycle. That's what the dogs do, right? That's what we do. We shake, right? I like to twerk a little bit. That makes me feel good, right? But it
going back to humor, right? Just using things with humor and movement, and
it gets me back in my body. It's fun. Like completing the stress cycle doesn't necessarily have to be so heavy. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be screaming and crying. It can be like laughing and joking and connecting with friends and twerking in the mirror or dancing, or, really getting back. And it's the things that make you feel back into your body. Like, you've ever had a laugh and you're like, oh, that ache in my belly, it feels so good. You're back. I had this moment
with some friends that I went to college with. We created a whole group chat and all of us said, thank you. We needed this. Yes. And I'm going to use your words to get us back in our bodies.
Yes. It doesn't necessarily have to be super sexual, right? To get you back in your body. It doesn't. But masturbation is also a great way to get back into your body. Yep. So.
Again, as you say that, I think, that's just a form of ways that people will ground themselves. And I think we just look at, what's healthy versus unhealthy, and making sure that you are, doing your best to continuously look and address this topic that we've been taught to say, we don't really talk about this.
Yeah. And, I think because we don't really talk about it, it's much easier to numb than to complete. Right. Yeah. And sometimes numbing does feel like completing. Right. Like, I drink half a bottle of wine and I'm complete. No. But no, you know what I mean? Like, I feel back in my body, but I'm going to regret it in the morning. It's not going to feel good.
Again, I'm going back to being so grateful to have this conversation with you, because the number one thing that stands out for me is communication, right? Whether it's therapy, life coaching, just listening to podcasts, being able to hear this, receive this, reflect for yourself, and share it with your significant other, your partner. That communication piece is going to go a long way. Let's be able to have these conversations opposed to avoid them.
Yes. 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 With everyone, right? Not just your partner, not just the people you're intimate with, but with everyone, like your friends, with your family, with your loved ones. Like, talk about it, normalize it,
normalize it, and I'm thinking about it again from a mental health and an emotional standpoint. I think when you're at peace with this topic and other topics in your world, I think there, specifically sexuality, it's almost like there's a ripple effect. If I'm at peace with this, there's this concept of being a ripple effect on maybe self-esteem and your own resilience.
Yeah. Yeah. Confidence. I see a lot of people kind of like trying, like, risk taking, because they have that confidence. And so when you take risks, you grow, right? You learn what you like and what you don't. And so it just leaves more room for expansion, right? For us to be more expansive in the way that we experience ourselves in our lives.
So I am going to just put out there the idea of tools, practical tools for navigating our sexual health.
Yeah.
What comes to mind? I'm putting you on the spot. What comes to mind when you think about practical tools for navigating sexual health?
Education, number one, biggest tool, right? Know your body, know yourself, know the bodies of your lovers. And the best way to do that is to know what you're doing, right? And so whether that's, podcasts or courses online, there are courses available at sexpertconsultants.com. Shameless plug. But like, educate yourself, know yourself, not just know yourself, but like know how things work, right? Because I can guarantee you that even if you had the best sex ed in your school, they didn't teach you about orgasms. They didn't teach you about pleasure. They didn't teach you about how your body works, right? So the first thing is educate yourself. Second thing is explore yourself, right? You cannot tell a partner what it is that you like if you don't know what that is, right? Yeah. One of my favorite sex therapists, her name is Esther Perel, and she says,
love her.
Right? She says that you should have a selfish relationship with pleasure, right? A selfish relationship with pleasure. Like you and pleasure should know each other very well, because when you do, then you can communicate that to your partners, right? You can say, oh, this feels good. When I'm with myself, this is what I do. You are your longest term lover. So you got to get it right first, right?
These are great practical tips and tools to know. So yeah.
So educate, explore. And then I think the last one, the last like tool that I would say in my toolbox is like experiment, right? Like, so you're exploring, right, what it is that feels good for you. But once you know that, like once you kind of have that roadmap, that's when you have the chance to like step outside of the box. Like what's this BDSM stuff, right? Like what's this new thing about, right? And don't be afraid to like be intentional about it, right? Like be intentional about your pleasure. I think that would be the last like 4.
Give yourself, I was just going to, sorry, as you said, I was just going to say, give yourself that time and space to be able to have these moments.
In the same way you make time to go to the gym and go grocery shopping, make time to be with yourself, right?
Almost like a date for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of like, I call these like pleasure practices, right? Like these things that you do for yourself for pleasure. And they don't have to be like long and drawn out. It can be 10 minutes, 20 minutes, but like once a day, just be intentional about your pleasure. What feels good to your body, not just sexually, but like what feels good to your body, right?
Reba, these are so helpful. And again, I'm going to bring this back to this concept of being vulnerable with yourself, with your partner. I feel like when we have these moments of vulnerability, that's often when we see breakthroughs in sexual health, in mental health, in our relationships.
Yeah. I think the biggest takeaway a lot of my clients get like from being vulnerable is that they don't know. It's like, what do you desire? What brings you pleasure? And I think the most vulnerable thing to say is, I don't know.
I don't
know.
Which is okay, right? It's okay not to know, but go back to your tips. Go back to thinking about the 3 E's that you said, right?
Exactly. What do you do? Like, yes, I don't know. And if you don't know, you can't possibly expect anyone else to know, right? And so, that's when you start with educating and exploring and experimenting.
Awareness. I always say awareness is step 1, and the follow-up is challenging yourself. So if we can challenge ourselves to communicate our needs, knowing ourselves, right, being more vulnerable, I think we're going to see a huge shift, or people will see a huge shift for themselves and in their relationships.
Yeah. I think the hardest part about being vulnerable is also like knowing the limits and the boundaries, right? I think sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we are vulnerable and we think it's safe, and then we find out that it's not, and we have to draw a boundary. And that's hard. And so that keeps us from wanting to do it again, right? It's like, oh, no, the last time I was vulnerable didn't work out for me, so I'm not doing that again. Can't live like that.
I think you just said it. Can't live like that. I think we need to look at how to be more open and, as you said, explore and discover ourselves, because I think that's going to contribute to a better quality of life and happiness all around, right? That's the point of living.
Absolutely.
Reba, I so appreciate you taking the time to do this. Clearly, we just kind of peeked in a little bit as to what this topic is, and we can see how it branches out, right? And there's so many other topics to be able to discuss when it comes to sexual health. I'm glad.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Right? I'm glad that we were able just to kind of look at it through the lens of mental health and the emotional health piece, and being able to care.
I think we scratched the surface for sure. Like, you know, in case people are wondering, like, what is, you know, why would I need to focus on my sexual health if my, you know, it's important. So
scratch the surface. There's so much more to look at. And I think we're just kind of bringing up these topics just to be able to have that awareness. So thank you. Thank you. Anyone listening to this, please go and follow and contact Reba. She has a wealth of information. She's on social media. She has her own website. Reba, remind us of your website.
Yeah, so I have two. If you want to work directly with me, I'm rebathediva.com. That's my website. But if you just want to look, if you're looking for just generalized public classes, private classes from a network of experts, I do own a company called Sexpert Consultants, where we have a network of trained consultants who are happy to work with you and help you. And so you can visit us online at sexpertconsultants.com.
Thank you, Reba. I'm going to